Okay, so we last talked about norms and sanctions, how they're kind of policed in our society, and we were talking about three different types of norms. We have folkways, which are kind of just informal rules that go without saying that people can break, but if you do, you might receive some type of negative sanction. So things like, facing the wrong way on an elevator, engaging in sustained eye contact with someone longer than what's socially considered normative would be examples of folkways, right? Mores are more official. Typically, if you violate or break a more, you might get sanctioned in forms of getting a fine or being ticketed or something. Oftentimes, mores are built into the laws of a society. So the difference between just deviating and breaking a norm versus breaking a law is that laws have formal sanctions attached to them. You might get a ticket or a fine, etc., or you might get fired from a job or kicked out of a class or kicked out of a school or university if you break a more. Taboos, the most severe form. These are violations of norms that are considered to be crucial to a society's moral center, their moral foundation. They are always negatively sanctioned. So a couple examples of taboos in United States culture would be cannibalism, right? Definitely don't approve or appreciate the eating of other human beings in any context, and incest, right? So two different behaviors that would be considered very taboo in our society. So let's talk a little bit about cultural universals. These are patterns or traits that are globally common to all societies. So an example of a cultural universal, a cultural practice or a cultural trait that every culture practices in some capacity would be families, right? A family unit is recognized in virtually every society. Now, how family is defined and what actually constitutes a family unit definitely varies from one society to the next, one culture to another. However, it is a cultural universal that every society in the known world practices some form of family kinship, right? Wedding ceremonies and death rituals or funeral rites are also cultural universals. Almost every society practices some form of mating ritual, some form of death ritual as well. Interestingly, a study once found that facial expressions, so how we respond to stimuli in our social environments, are also cultural universals. For example, people in societies that have never been exposed to industrialized civilizations, mass media, etc., still produce similar facial reactions when they're cued with certain stimuli. So one cultural anthropologist years ago conducted this really famous study where he went to this society where people were living in what was still a hunter-gatherer society. They didn't have advancements in technology. They didn't have things like the internet and electricity, Facebook, whatever. So this culture, this society really kind of lived in its own world. And this anthropologist that came, I think, from the United States, went into the society and was curious to see how these people would respond facially. What facial expressions would they make when they were kind of cued with certain situations or stimuli that would be things that we would experience in our society in the United States. So, for example, this anthropologist, was obviously working through a translator with someone who could communicate with people in this society. And they found this individual that was living in this society, and the anthropologist said, "What facial expression would you make if your friends came?" And the individual smiled. He had a pleasant grin. The anthropologist asked, "What facial expression would you make if your child just died?" And the individual kind of furrowed his brow and looked down and looked defeated. They asked, "What would your face look like if you were about to fight?" And this person snarled up their face and tried to look intimidating. And then lastly, "What would your face look like if you stepped on a smelly dead pig?" And the individual, as you can see, made a disgusted face. So the interesting finding from this particular anthropological study was that individuals from different societies, different cultures around the world, even individuals that have never communicated or interacted with one another before, had a culturally universal system of facial expressions, right? Things like smiling when we're happy, frowning when we're sad, wrinkling our face in disgust when something gross happens is another example of a cultural universal. There's also a distinction between high culture and popular culture, or pop culture, as it's more commonly referred to today. High culture refers to cultural behaviors, ideas, and practices that are associated with any society's elitist group. So, for example, in the United States, attending the opera or the ballet, higher class things that cost a lot more money are typically associated with high culture. For example, going to a 5-star restaurant and ordering a $600 bottle of wine off the menu, or even dining in a restaurant that would have a $600 bottle of wine on the menu, would be examples of high culture in our society. On the flip side of high culture is popular culture, which is also referred to as low culture, or pop culture for short. So pop culture, a term that you're probably a lot more familiar with, but you probably think of things like maybe, for example, Taylor Swift or The Real Housewives or The Bachelor, TV shows, artists, aspects of our society that are associated with more mainstream or typical people versus the elitist or the top 1% or upper echelon of society, refers to popular culture. So the culture, behaviors, and ideas that are popular with most people in any given society. Most of us in a society don't have the financial means to go to restaurants and order $600 bottles of wine, or purchase, season passes that are thousands of dollars to an opera or a ballet house in a large nearby city or metropolitan area, right? However, many of us may be able to splurge once in a while and get a ticket in the nosebleed seats to a Taylor Swift concert. Or when we go out to eat at an Applebee's, we might order a Bud Light, right, for $4.99 instead of getting that $600 bottle of wine. So those would be aspects of popular culture, behaviors and ideas, values, and beliefs that are popular with most people in a society, versus high culture, which caters typically just to an elitist few in a given society. Societies also have subcultures and countercultures. Subcultures are groups that share a specific identification which is apart from a society's majority, even as the members exist within the larger society. So within the United States, I might identify as part of US culture and United States culture and society, but I also might have a subculture, a sub-identity. I, for example, identify within the subculture of being a foodie. I love food, I love cooking, I love exploring places and trying out different cuisines from different regions and areas of the United States, so I identify with foodie culture. Other examples of subcultures might be things like hipsters or bikers. They're specific groups of people that have their own values, their own norms, their own beliefs and customs and practices, but they still exist within a larger main culture of society. Countercultures, on the other hand, are groups or subcultures that often push back against the mainstream culture or mainstream society in an attempt to change how a society functions. So countercultures are oftentimes a lot more politically driven or socially driven, driven to kind of create be some form of catalyst of social change within a society. So some examples of this were in the 1960s, there were hippies and beatniks, which really supported movements associated with free love. They were Vietnam protesting. They supported things like the Stonewall riots, which was an LGBT plus advocacy and rebellion to try and achieve equality for the LGBT plus community. During that time, we also, of course, had the civil rights movement, which is another counterculture. The second wave of feminism took place during that time. So any group of people that kind of form their own culture that is countering or trying to contrast or challenge the mainstream culture to make adjustments to larger society is a counterculture. A couple more things here. Cultural change. Culture, like society, like human beings, is constantly evolving. New cultural objects, cultural ideals and ideas and behaviors are constantly being discovered and invented. Just think, for example, how the invention of the smartphone changed US culture pertaining to virtually every aspect of social life, right? The workforce changed dramatically with the advent of the smartphone. I carry this thing with me all the time. I respond to emails to this. In a pinch, I will log on to Blackboard and make updates. If a link is broken to an assigned reading or something, I might pull up my Blackboard app on my phone, log in, and make adjustments to our course website. our workforce changed because of this. It used to be, you'd go to work, your 9 to 5 job, Monday through Friday, you'd go home, have nights and evenings and weekends off for a lot of occupations. Now we're kind of expected to work around the clock. If I get an email from a student at 11 o'clock at night and I happen to see it, odds are I'm going to respond to it right away if I have a minute, just because it's kind of become this new expected norm of our work culture that we're constantly available as educators to our students, and that's the same in other fields of work as well. Think about how the invention of the smartphone changed social life in the United States, right? We're constantly on these things. It used to be the case that I could go a week without even looking at my phone. I would only use my cell phone to call my mom once a week and check in, or to shoot a text to a friend to see if they wanted to hang out in person. And now we rely on our phones for all types of things, social media. We're glued to our phones for Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all of these different devices. It polices our dating lives now. It used to be to meet someone, to court someone for a new relationship, you had to go places, whether it was to a mall or to a restaurant or a bar, to actually meet people face to face. Now we have dating apps, things like Tinder and, Bumble and Match.com, eHarmony, where we can meet people all using this device. So this one cultural object produced so much cultural change stemming from it. And that's just one example of how society and culture, the objects that we use and the meanings that we attach to them, are constantly evolving and in flux. However, not all aspects of culture change at the same pace. Oftentimes, one part of culture will change, and then it will take a lot of time, oftentimes several years or even decades, for the rest of society to kind of adapt to that cultural change. And this process is referred to as cultural lag. So a lot of times we'll see material culture will often change first, and non-material culture will lag behind, right? Smartphones have been around for, over a decade now, at least, if not longer. But it didn't automatically change the non-material aspects of our life as soon as the smartphone was invented, right? Look how long it took for things like Snapchat and TikTok to be developed after the advent of the smartphone, right? And those apps really changed the way we communicate with people. But right when the smartphone was first created, it wasn't like people just stopped calling and talking to people on the phone and people just automatically used things like Snapchat and Facebook Messenger to communicate, right? Those changes took years to develop. Another great example of cultural lag. Have you ever wondered why we only go to school 9 months out of the year and still have summers off? Right? That's not just a coincidence. That's actually a result of cultural lag. So when universal school came about in the 1800s, right, again around the time of the Industrial Revolution, which spurred the field of sociology in the first place, right? But in the 1800s, the school year was designed to match the technology that was available at the time. So most parents in the 1800s were still working as farming and agricultural societies. And in the summer months, that was the busy time of the year for planting and harvesting crops, they still needed the help of their school-aged children. So children could go to school from the months of September through May, when farming season was typically not at its peak in most places around the world, but they needed students to be able to have summers off so they could still go home and help their families during the busy farming season. Now, while the majority of people are no longer farmers in the United States, and there's not necessarily a need for the school year to only be 9 months out of the year, theoretically, we could go to school 12 months out of the year and just have shorter work days, right? Shorter class days, or maybe only have school Monday, Wednesday, and Friday every week, But we still have this result of cultural lag, where we still have summers off as a result of this previously established norm in our society that was designed to match the technology and the needs of culture at that given time. Theoretical perspectives on culture. Lastly, functionalists largely see culture as an essential feature of society. Again, think of Durkheim and his ideas of the collective consciousness, right, and social solidarity. We're all in this together. Cultural norms function to support the maintenance of society, and cultural values guide people to make good decisions for society as a whole so society can function. Conflict theorists, however, consider how inequalities exist across and between cultural systems. Some cultural norms privilege certain groups and marginalize others. Strong ties to ethnocentrism and cultural imperialism can also inherently rank certain cultures as being less important or less valuable than others. And lastly, symbolic interactionists explore how societies create and assign meanings to symbols, norms, and values, and how those vary across different cultures. So symbolic interactionists would argue that culture is socially constructed and that the interactions people have the power to maintain or change cultures across time and place.